It was a bitterly cold morning, the kind of morning when even the air seemed sharp against the skin. Snow lined the sidewalks, and the lake at the edge of town had been frozen for weeks. Children often played nearby, their laughter echoing across the icy surface, though the older people in the community often warned them to stay away from the thinner patches. That morning, 2 children had wandered down to the lake with no idea that their games were about to turn dangerous. Their small boots crunched over the frosty ground as they chased each other closer and closer to the wide sheet of ice. They laughed as they stepped onto the frozen surface, their voices carrying in the stillness of winter. The ice seemed solid at first, and it gave them a sense of excitement. They shuffled further out, pretending they were explorers walking on a frozen world. The cold air nipped at their faces, but they didn't care. They were lost in the thrill of the moment, skipping and sliding across the glittering surface. But beneath their feet, the ice was thinner than it appeared. The sound came suddenly, sharp and terrifying. A loud crack ripped through the quiet morning, and both children froze in place. Before they could turn back, the ice gave way. In an instant, they plunged into the freezing water, their screams piercing through the air. Panic set in as they struggled to stay afloat, their small hands clawing at the slippery edges of ice that only broke further with each attempt. The lake swallowed them halfway, dragging them into the kind of cold that steals the breath before a cry can even escape. Not far away, a stranger was walking along the path. He wasn't headed anywhere special, just moving slowly through the quiet morning. The world around him seemed peaceful until the screams cut through the silence. At first, he thought he imagined it, but then he heard it again, 2 voices calling desperately for help. His heart raced as he turned his head toward the sound. He saw the children flailing in the water, their arms reaching out as the ice cracked around them. For a second, he froze, stunned at the sight, but instinct took over. He sprinted toward the lake, his feet slipping on the snowy ground, his breath turning ragged in the icy air. By the time he reached the edge, the children were barely holding on. The freezing water had already numbed their movements. He didn't stop to think of his own safety. Dropping down to his knees, he crawled across the surface, keeping his weight low to avoid breaking more of the fragile ice. Every movement forward was risky. The ice groaned beneath him, thin lines spreading out like a web. But he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the children's terrified faces. The boy's cries grew weaker as his small hands slipped, and the girl's head dipped under for a moment before coming up again, gasping for air. The stranger's heart pounded. He reached one hand out, calling to them to hold on. His voice was strong but filled with urgency, trying to reassure them even as his own fear clawed at him. The cold seeped through his clothes as he inched closer, the ice cracking louder with every move. Then, with a sudden snap, the surface beneath him gave way. Icy water swallowed his body halfway, shocking his system with its unbearable cold. For a moment, he gasped, the pain making it hard to breathe. But he forced himself to stay focused. The children were right in front of him. Fighting against the numbing water, he lunged forward and grabbed the boy's arm. The boy cried out as the stranger pushed him toward the edge of the broken ice, urging him to kick and climb up. With trembling strength, the boy managed to get a grip on the unbroken surface nearby. The stranger turned to the girl next. She was weaker, her lips trembling, her little hands slipping again and again. He reached out and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. With everything he had left, he pushed her upward, trying to lift her onto the stronger part of the ice. His own body shook violently from the freezing water, but he ignored the pain. His only thought was to get her out. At last, her small body slid onto the edge, and she clung tightly, coughing and gasping for air. Now both children were on the ice, but the man was still in the water, struggling against the weight of soaked clothes and the biting cold. He pressed his arms down, trying to lift himself out, but the edges kept breaking under his weight. Each attempt felt harder than the last, his muscles stiffening. The children cried out for him, their voices shaking. He tried again, this time crawling forward with every bit of strength left in his arms. Finally, he managed to grip a solid piece and dragged himself onto the ice, shivering uncontrollably. The three of them lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling under the winter sky. In the distance, voices began to shout. People had heard the cries and were running toward the lake. Relief washed over the children, who clung to each other, their eyes never leaving the man who had risked everything for them. He forced a weak smile, trying to calm them as footsteps approached. The morning that had begun with laughter and games had turned into a scene of fear, struggle, and unexpected bravery. Asterisk. The cold morning air was filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and worried voices as a few neighbors rushed toward the lake. The children were pulled into warm blankets by the first people who arrived, their little bodies shaking, their teeth chattering as if the world itself was trembling with them. They clung to each other, still crying softly, but alive. The stranger who had risked everything for them remained on the icy ground, his body drenched, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as if they no longer belonged to him. He tried to brush off the help, insisting the children were the only ones who needed care, but it was clear he was in no better condition. His clothes clung to him like frozen weights, and every movement was slow, heavy, and painful. Someone shouted for hot water, another for more blankets, while a neighbor called an ambulance. The children's parents arrived in a rush, their faces pale with horror. They ran to their children, dropping to their knees, hugging them so tightly it seemed they might never let go again. The mother's sobs filled the air, while the father's voice broke as he whispered words of thanks, both to the children and to the man who had saved them. The stranger, still shaking, gave a faint nod, his eyes focused on the children, making sure they were safe. He asked no questions, demanded no attention. He only seemed relieved that their cries had stopped, and their small faces were still warm with life. The ambulance arrived, and while the children were checked and wrapped in heating packs, the paramedics urged the man to climb inside too. He resisted at first, embarrassed, muttering that he was fine, but his body betrayed him. His lips were pale, his fingers stiff, and his shivering uncontrollable. They insisted he come along, and finally, with a weak smile, he agreed. Inside the vehicle, he sat quietly beside the children as they huddled under layers of warmth, the sound of the siren echoing faintly in the distance. Every time the children looked at him, their wide eyes filled with gratitude, though no words came. They were too weak to speak, but their gaze said everything. At the hospital, doctors rushed to treat them. The children were placed in warm beds, fluids running into them, their faces slowly regaining color. The stranger was examined too, his body dangerously cold but stable. He sat on the edge of a bed, still wet, still shivering, but his attention never left the children. When he finally heard the doctors say, "They're safe now," he closed his eyes and breathed out deeply, as though the weight of the world had been lifted. That was all he needed to hear. Hours passed, and by the afternoon, the children's condition improved. Their parents walked into the room where the man was resting. They stood silently for a moment, tears filling their eyes as they looked at him. Words seemed too small for what they wanted to say. The father finally broke the silence, his voice low and unsteady. He told the man that without him, their children would not be alive. He said no reward could ever measure what he had done. The mother placed her hand on the man's shoulder, whispering through her tears that he was now forever a part of their family story, a story they would never forget. The stranger, however, lowered his head. He shook it gently, saying he only did what anyone else would have done. He didn't want thanks, he didn't want recognition. He only wanted the children to be safe. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of quiet sincerity. The parents exchanged glances, realizing this man was not just a rescuer, he was someone who carried humility as deeply as he carried courage. The next day, the town was buzzing with the story. Neighbors spoke in awe about the rescue. Some called him a hero, others called him an angel sent at the right moment. Yet, despite the growing whispers of admiration, the man returned to his modest life quietly. He walked the same streets, wore the same worn coat, and spoke with the same calm tone. To him, life hadn't changed. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was simply someone who had been in the right place at the right time. But the children's parents couldn't shake the thought that such bravery, such sacrifice, could not be left unnoticed. They felt a deep need to show their gratitude in a way that would truly make a difference. Quietly, they began to think of what they could do. The answer came not from wealth or material value alone, but from a desire to give him something that reflected how much he had given to them. They wanted a gift that would carry weight, a gesture that would tell him, "You are not forgotten. You are cherished." The man, unaware of their plans, carried on as if nothing had happened. Yet inside, his body still ached from the icy water. His clothes, damaged and heavy, hung drying in his small home. He moved slowly, the memory of the freezing cold still clinging to him, though he never once complained. He told no one of his pain. He simply reminded himself that the children were alive, and that was all that mattered. But days later, something would happen that he could never have expected. Something that would make him pause on his quiet walk home, his heart thudding as a sleek luxury SUV pulled to a stop in front of him. The days after the rescue seemed quieter, almost as if the town itself was catching its breath. The children were home again, wrapped in layers of blankets, surrounded by the warmth of their family. Their parents stayed close, never letting them wander too far, shaken by how quickly joy had almost turned to tragedy. In their house, the talk was always about the man who had jumped into the frozen lake. Every meal, every bedtime story, his name came up again and again. The children spoke of him with shining eyes, calling him their hero. They told their parents how he had reached for them with such determination, how he had ignored the freezing water and his own fear. Meanwhile, the man himself went back to his modest routines. He walked the same snowy path each morning, sometimes coughing quietly when no one was near, still feeling the weight of the icy water in his lungs. His hands remained red and cracked from the cold, his clothes worn from that day, but he never mentioned it to anyone. Neighbors who recognized him would nod in respect, whispering behind his back about his courage. A few tried to approach him with praise, but he brushed it off with a simple shake of his head. To him, there was nothing to celebrate. 2 children had needed help, and he had been there. That was all. That the parents of the children, however, felt differently. They could not rest easily knowing that their gratitude had not been fully expressed. Words seemed too small for what he had done. They remembered how he had pulled himself out of the water, shivering, his body broken from exhaustion, yet his eyes never leaving their children. They knew a simple thank you was not enough. At night, they sat together, discussing what could possibly show their appreciation. They did not want to embarrass him, but they wanted him to understand how deeply his bravery had touched them. One evening, as snowflakes drifted softly outside their window, the children's father made a decision. He said that some gestures are remembered for a lifetime, and this man deserved such a gesture. Their family had the means to offer more than words. The mother agreed, her eyes wet with tears. They both knew the gift had to reflect the miracle he had given them, the miracle of their children's lives. While the family planned in silence, the man continued his days unaware. He rose early, walked through the snow-covered streets, sometimes stopping to help a neighbor carry groceries or shovel a walkway. He lived simply, without complaint, never drawing attention to himself. Yet, when he passed the frozen lake, his eyes lingered for a moment, not in pride but in reflection. The memory of the children's cries and the icy water still haunted him. Though he would never admit it aloud. In town, the story of the rescue began to fade for some. People returned to their routines, the drama of the moment settling into memory. But not for the family. For them, each time they looked at their children, they saw the man's sacrifice. Their gratitude grew stronger with every passing day. Then, one morning, everything began to change. The man had just stepped outside his small home, pulling his old coat tighter around him as the wind bit at his skin. The streets were quiet, only the distant sound of a car breaking the silence. He didn't pay attention at first, until the sound grew closer and a sleek luxury SUV turned the corner and rolled to a stop right in front of his house. Its polished surface reflected the pale winter sun, looking so out of place against the modest homes lined along the street. The man paused, puzzled. He rarely saw vehicles like this in his neighborhood. Slowly, the doors opened and he saw the children step out, bundled in warm coats, their parents behind them. The children ran forward, their little boots crunching against the snow, their voices calling out in excitement. The man froze in surprise as the children wrapped their arms around him, their faces pressed against his coat. He bent down, gently patting their shoulders, his eyes flickering with both warmth and confusion. Their parents approached, their expressions filled with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. The father extended his hand, his grip firm, while the mother's eyes shimmered with tears she could not hold back. They said they had come not just to thank him again, but to show him that his actions would never be forgotten. The man shook his head softly, almost embarrassed, murmuring that saving children was simply what anyone should have done. But the father placed a hand on his shoulder and told him firmly, "Not everyone would have risked their life like you did. You gave us back our children. That is something no parent can ever repay with just words." The man stood in silence, uncertain of what was happening, his gaze shifting between the shining SUV and the family standing before him. He could feel that something more was about to unfold, something he hadn't expected and certainly hadn't asked for. The children tugged at his hand, pulling him toward the SUV with wide smiles. He followed hesitantly, his breath forming clouds in the icy air, his heart beginning to pound with the same intensity he had felt on the day of the rescue. He had no idea what awaited him, but in that moment, he sensed that his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The man's steps were slow and unsure as the children guided him closer to the SUV. Its dark, polished frame reflected the winter light, standing out against the faded colors of the street. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some even stepping outside, curious about what such an expensive car was doing parked in front of a modest home. The man felt uneasy. He wasn't used to attention, and the warmth of the children's hands tugging on his arm made his heart race even faster. He looked at their parents, as if silently asking for an explanation. The children's father walked forward, his expression steady but filled with emotion. He placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder and told him again how deeply they owed him. "When I held my children after that day," he said quietly, "I realized there is no gift big enough to match what you gave us. But we wanted to try. We wanted to do something that reminds you every day that you are not forgotten." The man shook his head, his voice low, almost whispering, telling them it wasn't necessary. But the father raised his hand, stopping him gently. "Please don't refuse this. It's not about luxury. It's about gratitude. It's about showing you that what you did will never be treated as ordinary." The mother stepped closer, her eyes soft, her voice trembling as she explained that their family had searched for a way to honor him. She told him they wanted to give him something not only useful, but something that symbolized the miracle he had given them. She gestured toward the SUV. For a moment, the man thought they were simply offering him a ride somewhere, but when the father pulled a set of keys from his coat pocket and held them out, the truth hit him like a shock of cold air. The man stared at the keys in silence, his breath visible in the frosty air. He blinked, as if not sure he had heard correctly. The father explained again, slowly and clearly, that the SUV was his. It was not just a gift, it was a statement, a symbol of gratitude for the life he had risked. The man's heart pounded. He stepped back, shaking his head, insisting he couldn't possibly accept something so great. But the children wrapped their arms around him again, their voices pleading softly, telling him it was theirs to give and his to take. The neighbors who had gathered whispered among themselves, some gasping in surprise, others smiling through teary eyes. They all knew the man's life was simple, his means limited. Seeing him faced with such a gift seemed surreal. He tried again to refuse, but the mother's words stopped him. She told him that sometimes, accepting a gift was not about taking, it was about allowing others to express the love and gratitude they carried inside. The man's eyes grew wet as he finally took the keys, his hand trembling. He looked at the shining SUV, then at the family who stood before him, their faces filled with respect and affection. The children pulled him toward the car, urging him to open the door. He did so slowly, almost in disbelief. The smell of new leather filled the air as the door opened, the interior warm and inviting. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the seat, his reflection staring back at him from the polished surface. The father encouraged him to sit inside. With hesitant steps, he lowered himself into the driver's seat, his hands running over the wheel as though it might disappear if he touched it too hard. The children giggled with joy, climbing into the back, while their mother leaned against the door, smiling warmly. "This isn't charity," she said softly. "It's a reminder. A reminder that miracles still happen, and sometimes we are given the chance to be someone else's miracle." The man sat in silence, his chest rising and falling heavily. His eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, tears glistened at the corners. He turned to the family and whispered words that barely made it past his lips. "I don't deserve this." But the father replied firmly, "Yes, you do." More than anyone. The neighbors clapped softly, some wiping their eyes. The sound of support filled the air, making the moment feel even more powerful. The man, once so unnoticed in the crowd of life, now sat in a gift he never could have imagined, given by people whose lives he had saved. He stepped out of the SUV again, still overwhelmed, and pulled the children close, holding them as if they were his own. He thanked their parents, though the words felt too small compared to the wave of emotion surging through him. The family assured him this was only the beginning, that they would always remember him, not just as the man who saved their children, but as part of their family story forever. As the SUV gleamed under the pale winter sun, the moment carried a weight far beyond metal or luxury. It was about sacrifice, gratitude, and the extraordinary bond created on a frozen lake when one man chose to risk everything for two lives he didn't even know. Asterisk. The man stood there with the keys still in his hand, his breath forming clouds in the winter air, his heart heavy with emotions he didn't know how to name. The children clung to him tightly, their small arms wrapped around his waist, as if they never wanted to let go. The neighbors gathered nearby began to cheer softly, their voices carrying warmth across the frozen street. For years, this man had walked past them quietly, unnoticed by most. But today, everyone looked at him differently. Today, he was more than just another face in the crowd. He was the man who had risked everything when it mattered most. He bent down slowly, looking into the children's eyes. Their cheeks were rosy from the cold, but their smiles glowed with pure gratitude. "You don't need to thank me," he whispered gently. "Just live happily, every single day. That's all I could ever ask." The little girl reached up and touched his cheek with her small hand, her eyes wide and sincere. "But you are our hero," she said softly. Her brother nodded quickly, his voice trembling but certain. "We'll never forget you." Those words sank deep into the man's heart, words more valuable than any gift could ever be. Still, when he turned his gaze back to the shining SUV, his chest tightened. It wasn't the car itself that moved him. It was what it represented. It wasn't about luxury, wealth, or status. It was about the message behind it, that his sacrifice had been seen, remembered, and cherished. He thought of how many people lived their lives unnoticed, their struggles invisible. But this moment reminded him that sometimes, even the quietest acts of courage could ripple outward and change lives. The father stepped closer and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "This SUV is only a symbol," he said firmly. "It's not the true gift. The true gift is knowing that we will never forget what you did. You saved our children. You gave us our family back. No matter where you go, you will always carry our gratitude with you." The man's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, unable to form words for a moment. His eyes glistened with tears that slipped silently down his cheeks. The neighbors applauded louder now, clapping their hands together, their faces filled with respect. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. They had seen tragedy nearly strike their community, but they had also seen courage rise against it. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, yet light with hope. The man, still overwhelmed, finally nodded and accepted the keys fully. He slid them into his pocket, not as an object of pride, but as a reminder that what he had done mattered. The children begged him to drive the SUV, their voices playful and filled with excitement. He smiled faintly and agreed. With the parents encouraging him, he climbed into the driver's seat once more. The engine started smoothly, its sound powerful yet calm, and for a moment he just sat there, feeling the warmth of the interior wrap around him. The children laughed in the back seat, their joy filling the car like music. He drove slowly down the street, the neighbors cheering and waving as he passed. For the first time in a long while, his heart felt light. When he returned and parked, he stepped out of the vehicle, still shaken by the enormity of the moment. The parents hugged him, their arms tight, their gratitude spoken not just in words, but in the depth of their embrace. The man whispered a quiet thank you, his voice thick with emotion. He had never asked for recognition, never sought attention, yet here he was, standing in the center of something he never thought possible. As the day faded into evening, the children's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound that would stay with him forever. He walked back into his small home that night, but nothing felt quite the same. The walls seemed warmer, the silence less heavy. He had always lived a modest life, unnoticed and quiet, but now, he carried something new inside him, a sense of belonging, a reminder that kindness and courage never vanish into the cold. They live on in the hearts of those who are touched by them. In the days that followed, the story of the frozen lake spread beyond the town. People spoke of the stranger who saved 2 children and how a family had honored him with a gift that symbolized more than money ever could. Strangers began greeting him with respect, offering handshakes, smiles, and kind words. Though he remained humble, never boasting, people could see that he had been changed, not by the SUV itself, but by the love and gratitude that came with it. For the children, he became more than a rescuer. He became a lifelong hero, someone they looked up to with pure admiration. Every time they saw him, they ran to him with joy, treating him as family. For their parents, he was the man who had given them back their most precious treasure. And for the town, he was proof that even in the coldest, darkest moments, humanity's warmth could shine through. And so, what began as a terrifying morning on a frozen lake ended as a story of courage, gratitude, and unexpected miracles. The luxury SUV parked outside his modest home became a quiet symbol, not of wealth, but of the truth that sometimes the greatest rewards in life come not from seeking them, but from giving everything you have for others.